Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to today's mini lesson. I'm going to keep this short and simple and brief, and then I'm going to apply it to the poem that you're going to read for Wednesday's class. So I'm going to introduce you to the concept of a literary movement, and then introduce you to two specific literary movements. So, like an art movement in general, a literary movement is something that we define after the fact. We would look back on a certain time period and read the poetry and the short stories and the novels that were written during that time and look for trends in the style and the way that the characters are portrayed, the way that the story is told. And we would define that time period then as a movement based on those shared characteristics. So we're going to look at two literary movements in particular. One is called Romanticism, and then the other is called Realism. And we'll be able to use these as a way to help us analyze the poetry that we're reading. So and this is specifically the American version. Obviously, this was happening as well in Europe, but we're looking specifically at the American Romanticism period, which was roughly from 1820 to 1865. So this movement, specifically these stories and the poetry, tried to portray the world idealistically, which tried to glorify the world and almost portray it in almost a more positive light than what might actually have been going on during that time. It was a movement that was highly imaginative. So the authors were very, really tapping into their imaginations when telling the stories and when writing their poetry. There was usually a strong emotional intensity to the writing. They would often look at the characters or the narrator as like these common people, and as a way to glorify them, almost treat them as heroes. So showing that the common person, even living in a normal life, can be heroic. They often looked at nature as a source of knowledge and spirituality, and almost a place of refuge, as like a place of safety. So nature was always glorified and romanticized. And then the universe was seen as this mysterious, almost irrational and incomprehensible place, a place of so much unknown. But they really embraced the unknown and included those ideas in their writing. And the language was very elevated, very formal, poetic, using maybe more complex words and sentence structures. And so these, when we look back on the writing during this time period, these are all the elements that a lot of the authors were sort of tapping into and using in their writing. So now, where did it come from? Why were writers writing in this way during this time? It was really a reaction to what was going on during the time. So during this time, around mid 1800s is what we would call the American Industrial Revolution. So there was this population growth, urban sprawl from like these center city areas, and there was this rise of the factory system. So a lot of people, a lot of farmers were being displaced from their farms, and they didn't have really a lot to provide other than just their labor. So a lot of people were forced into the factory system. And, there was this transition from like hand production methods to more of like the factory system, manufacturing, iron production, and, the use of steam power. There was the social and political norms during the Age of the Enlightenment, which was just before this time period, where there was kind of like an emphasis on the scientific method. People were using science to understand nature, to come up with answers to the unknown. And so there was this rationalization of nature. And then also there was this concept of the American frontier. People were pushing out west and, kind of creating new towns and cities out in the great unknown. And so they were really excited about these new opportunities and seen as adventures. So because of all of this that was going on, a lot of authors were writing in this way. I think part of it is, they were trying to kind of counter the Industrial Revolution. A lot of people were being kind of minimized and were simply seen as just a cog in the wheel. They were just being used for their power, and they wanted to kind of glorify the average person. And they wanted to kind of break away from this rigid Age of Enlightenment, of using science to explain everything. And they really embraced the unknown of nature. So, as a way to kind of show you the concept of Romanticism, I like to use these images. So, if one were to romanticize the city, they would try to portray it in this like glorified way, this almost ideal way of this shining beacon. If they would want to, glorify the farming, agricultural life, they would show these people kind of enjoying the weather, picking the crops, children sleeping in the shade of a wagon. And then if you wanted to glorify war, looking at the general riding on horseback. So we've got Napoleon here on horseback, charging into battle, all kind of visually capturing what Romanticism is all about. Now, after Romanticism, there was this shift towards what we would call realism. So this was around mid 1800s to the turn of the century, 1900, approximately. So realism does not sugarcoat anything. Romanticism tries to, kind of idealize. Realism tries to render reality as closely as possible in comprehensive detail. The characters are really more important than the action and the plot. Trying to put characters in complex ethical decisions and showing that life is challenging, and that life is not always just black and white. It's not so easy. The way that they would write, the word choice, the diction was very natural. It was just the common way that people would talk. It was not very heightened or poetic in tone. And sometimes it was even comical or satiric or just very matter of fact, very cut and dry, trying to capture the way that people would actually communicate. And then they tried to maintain objectivity in their presentation, meaning like the author or the narrator wouldn't really offer their own opinions. They would just kind of presented the story as is, presented the ideas in their writing, and then let the reader try to decide what is right and wrong and make meaning out of it. So again, showing, what's, if we were to as the opposite of romanticize would be to portray things realistically. If we were to portray the city life as realistic, you would have to show just how gritty the work was. And this is just a child working, and you can see just how dirty the jobs were and how challenging and how much they struggled to build up, these growing cities. If you wanted to, portray farming realistically, you couldn't sugarcoat it. It wasn't always easy. And here's a picture of during the Dust Bowl of the 1930s, people just trying to get by and, farm in this really, barren soil. And then up here, if you're going to portray war realistically, you can't leave out the fact that people and, tons of people die during war. That it's not that it's pessimistic, it's just portraying things realistically, showing all sides of it. So just showing, I want to show you two poems that kind of capture the idea of romanticism and realism. Here's a poem that would be considered a romantic poem. And I don't want you to confuse romanticism with romantic. Romantic, I think we had this idea of it always means love and romance, but that's not what romanticism means. Romanticism is more just like idealism. So here in this poem, William Wordsworth is trying to portray the strong emotions he feels upon seeing a rainbow. So it reads, "My heart leaps up when I behold a rainbow in the sky. So was it when my life began. So is it now I am a man. So be it when I shall grow old or let me die. The child is father of the man, and I could wish my days to be bound each to each by natural piety." And so what he's really doing here is just kind of describing the joy he feels and how he wants to be able to see nature through the eyes of a child, and really show just that wonder that he has, and try to embrace that every day. So very romantic way of portraying nature and, someone's reaction to seeing something so beautiful in nature. Now, here's a poem that I think is a little bit more realistic. It's by Stephen Crane. It's called "A Man Said to the Universe." So I'll just read this to you and kind of walk you through it. It reads, "A man said to the universe, 'Sir, I exist.' However, replied the universe, 'the fact has not created me a sense of obligation.'" And I think here's a little cartoon that goes along with it. I know my picture is sort of in the way. Can I move this? Yes, I can. So here's Calvin. This is from Calvin and Hobbes, the cartoon, if you're familiar with that. So we've got Calvin, and he's staring up into the stars, and he screams, "I'm significant." And he waits for a reply. And then he says, "Screamed the dust speck." So I like to show this because I think this captures the idea of realism pretty well. Because unlike Romanticism, which glorifies nature, realism often portrays nature as kind of a source of power that's indifferent to our existence. You know, it's not, the universe just exists, and it's not like it really cares whether or not we exist. We just exist along with it. And that's not just trying to say, to be pessimistic and say like we don't matter, because we do still matter. But realism will portray it as just very matter of fact. This is the way that it is. We're not going to sugarcoat or glorify it, and we're just going to kind of capture the way that reality really is. So I'm going to have you read a poem called Oranges, and I'm going to have you use the TP cast again just to kind of practice analyzing the poem. But I'm going to add an added layer and ask you to take note of any elements that you think the poem has that would make it either a romantic or a realistic poem. And again, when I say romantic, I don't mean love per se, but I mean romanticism. So is it idealizing the subject? Is it trying to glorify and portray the world in almost like a more pleasant or a better way than reality might actually be? Or is it portraying things realistically and just very matter of fact and very true to the way things are? So we'll be discussing this poem then on Wednesday. Thanks, everybody.